Hello there. Oh. Hello there. I've got a new microphone which I'm hoping is working. Apologies for the slight delay, only 2 minutes late, but for some reason things didn't boot up, so I think it's all working now. Let me know if you can hear me because this is a new device. It's good to see people coming in from all over the place. Jeff from Brooklyn. I used to hang out in Brooklyn all the time many years ago. I lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, and spent a lot of time in Brooklyn and do miss it. Okay, so yes, let me know if you can hear me. Also, there's the chat box, so chat away, talk to people, say whatever you want, slag me off. Also, you can ask questions, just put a Q, and so I can look for the Qs and look for questions. And you're coming in loud and clear. Oh, that's good. Sound is on, but a little low. Oh, one person's saying loud and clear, the other is saying a little low. Let me put this a little bit higher and see if that's any better. Sounds good. Okay, hopefully that's working. I was having real issues with my sound last year, and the problem was I couldn't hear it. I now have officially old man's hearing, so there's certain tones that I can't hear. So there was a tone in some of my talks that was driving some people mad, and I couldn't hear it at all. And I had my nephew round, who's like 17, and I did a sound check with him, and he could hardly listen to it, and I was like, I can't hear that at all. So hopefully now that's all sorted out. I've got a new device, new microphone, all of that. I will officially start in a second. Just kind of wanting to welcome you. Also, apologies for the time change issues. That always kind of catches me out. Usually I stick with the American time. Haven't done that this year, so we'll figure it out. But at the moment it's 11 a.m. Pacific daytime or whatever it is, and 6 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Anything else I want to tell you about? A few things coming up. Wake is happening. We've got loads of people coming. I think we've got 60 people. I think we might have 70 by the time it starts. Lots of really interesting speakers going to be there, so that's going to be fun. That's basically 5 days just hanging out with me in Belfast, talking about cool stuff, listening to music, hanging out in bars, that kind of stuff. And I have Spark, which is coming up in October, so if you're interested in that, check it out on my website. But yes, that's the advertising done, the sponsorship over. I will officially start. This will be my mark, and then I can cut this off in the edit. So hello and welcome to week 2 of Atheism for Lent. Now, I know a lot of you have done this before, but I wonder how many of you are new to it. If you're new to it, do let me know, because I'm interested. I kind of start to assume that most people have done 1 or 2, and some people have made this a yearly kind of pilgrimage. But whether you're new to it or not, what Atheism for Lent is doing is it's going to bring you on a journey. It's an intellectual journey, but it's also an existential journey. And it really is a way of approaching the work of radical theology and parotheology that I've been doing. So although it's not technically about that, by the last week you will hopefully see how my work fits into a certain tradition of religion and religious critique. And the whole movement is kind of a negation after a negation after a negation. And that's really kicks off this week. So you've done week 1, and week 1, I kind of often say this, but I go like, week 1 and week 2 are the most boring weeks. So you got to get through those, right? You got to be strong, get through first 2 weeks. By week 3, I think people start getting really interested, and then week 4, week 5, it really starts to become much more rich and interesting. So stick with it. But last week was just really the beginning. It was a reflection, and then we looked at the cosmological argument, the teleological, and the ontological arguments. Now, Those are the three biggies. There's other ones. There's what's called the presuppositional arguments for God, and there's other ones, argument from experience, that kind of thing. But there's basically a few buckets, and you can fit them in. And very, very quickly and easily, I'll just cover what you did last week. The cosmological argument, super simple. It's called the cosmological argument or the cosmological arguments because they're arguments from the existence of the cosmos. So that's all you have to remember about the cosmological argument is it's cosmological because they're arguments that rest on the existence of the cosmos. And then there's the teleological arguments. And the teleological arguments, telos meaning order, goal, so that the teleological arguments aren't arguments from the existence of the universe, but from the order of the universe. So that would be like fine-tuning stuff and, William Paley's watch that you did, but anything that's to do with the apparent design or order of the universe are teleological arguments. And then ontological arguments, ontology means the science of being, which in a way is kind of like you're doing ontology if you ask yourself something like, what is the nature of a human being, right? So what is a human being in their very essence? You're kind of doing ontology because you can say, well, people have 2 arms and 2 legs, but then you go, yeah, but that's not essential, right? There's lots of people who don't have 2 arms and 2 legs. So you go, okay, that's not essential. We have jobs, but having a job isn't essential. And you start to strip away, and then you start to kind of ask yourself, well, what is the essence of being human, right? So the ontological argument for the existence of God, or arguments, because again, there's a number of them, are arguments that start from the essence of the definition of God, of God's being. So it starts not with the cosmos, not with telos, it starts with a concept, God. And just from that concept, argues for the existence of God. So those are kind of the things you looked at. It's a good way to start Atheism for Lent because we are going to go on this journey now of critique and negation. So we have to have a starting point, a foothold. And last week was the foothold. This week it's hard to know what to call it. And it's hard to know what thinkers fit, right? I could have called this New Atheism and just done a lot of the kind of atheistic critiques that arose at the kind of start of the 21st century, right, the early 2000s. If I'm right in that thinking, the horsemen of the apocalypse, you've got Dennett, you've got Hitchens, you've got Harris, you've got Dawkins, right? You got all these thinkers at that time who were kind of like advocates for a type of rational critique of religion. Now, interestingly, I will talk about this in a few weeks, so I might even do a separate little talk, an extra talk about this if it doesn't fit. But what you see within that movement of New Atheism is very interesting because it has had within it movement, and this is true of all intellectual positions or whatever, there's movement. But the movement in the New Atheism is very interesting because and my friend Cadell Last is someone who articulates this very well, and he was the one who helped me see this clearly, because he used the example of, Dawkins is a good example of a rational critique of religion. And recently he debated Jordan Peterson, and me and Elliot are going to talk about that debate in the next Fundamentalists podcast, which we're doing next week, so I'm excited about that. But Dawkins famously was starting to debate Sam Harris. Sam Harris went from kind of reason to spirit, so he kind of like spirituality. So he got into kind of Buddhism and kind of meditation and all of that from within this movement. And whenever you see those two debate, you can see that they're kind of talking past each other, and Dawkins is kind of like has in the past been a bit bemused at what Harris is saying. And then when you look at Harris and Peterson, right, that's the move from spirit to religion. And then you see Harris kind of being a bit bemused about what Peterson is doing with his kind of Jungian religion. your reading of Christianity. And so interestingly, within that movement that was in the early 2000s, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the early 2000s, interestingly has morphed in strange kind of ways, and there has been a trad revival kind of within the new atheist movement. And weirdly now some of the proponents, as I say, have either gone spiritual or gone religious in various forms. Some of it has been Catholic, evangelical, and also kind of, Jungian. They're all different approaches that have been taken. But yes, all that to say, we're not doing new atheism as such, but we're doing more of the classical arguments that they borrowed from. So this week's readings, I think 3 of them are from the 18th century, and then the rest are kind of modern, more modern. But they are some of the best kind of classical arguments against what you just did last week. And they can be summed up in a few different ways. But you're going to begin with Jean Meslier. And I wanted to begin this week with Meslier. He's probably, in one sense, the most interesting of this week, because Meslier is the first modern writer to write a systematic critique of God, religion, and Christianity. It is a systematic critique that's philosophical, philosophically attacks the arguments for the existence of God. It's also sociological. It attacks the institution as, being in the hands of the powerful as a way of controlling the weak and the peasants. And also a critique of Christianity itself as, incoherent and hypocritical or wish fulfillment. So in Meslier, you have this incredible text called Testament. It is the first, as I say, the first systematic, modern, atheistic manuscript. And what's most interesting about it is he was a lifelong priest. He was a priest all his life, and in private, he was writing this text. And when he died, it was discovered. And it's interesting for a lot of reasons, right? He was also a very good priest. He was a priest who was very famous for standing up for his parishioners against the kind of lords. And there was one particular thing, you'll read about it in the reflection, where he stood up for his parishioners. And so he was a man who embraced a life of humility, a life of poverty, in the sense of he was a parish priest. He didn't live a lavish life. The only hypocrisy he had was that he was being a priest, preaching, giving out the sacraments without believing in it at all. And his justification for that in many ways is a few things. I mean, very practically, he was like, if I came out, I would probably be driven out or killed. So I would never get this work finished. So in a way, he wanted to finish this work. He believed it was important. And 2, he said, I have no other means of making a living. And also, he got to see it from the inside. So he got to write about this critique while being at the very heart of Christianity, religion, and belief in God. So his book Testament, it's not that it doesn't add anything to the philosophical arguments as such, but it is a precursor of Marx's critiques, of Freud's critiques. It's also got some kind of more philosophical critiques all in there. And I wanted to have him at the beginning of this week, partly as well as a symbol of how the best critiques arise from within. And that's a very dialectic idea as well, is it's not that you just have, one position here and then there's somebody who has an opposing position. It's when you get deeply into your own position, whatever position it is, whatever worldview you grew up with, there's a certain point that if you take it really seriously and if you go deeply into it, it's going to crack apart in some way. It's going to deepen, it's going to become more nuanced, and potentially, part or all of it will fall away. And so symbolically, there's something powerful in this idea of a priest who very gradually lost his faith in God, his beliefs. Him being the first systematic critique as someone who kind of understood it deeply from within. And there is a tradition in continental philosophy where a number of thinkers have said something similar to this, that only a Christian can be a good atheist, or only the priest can be an atheist. And there's, a few other different ways of saying it. People like Heidegger said it, Simone Weil said it, Ernst Bloch said it, Lacan said it. And there's a number of ways to interpret, and they all meant maybe something slightly different at times, but one of the ways to interpret that is that when you go most deeply into the theological world, you can begin to see it fall apart from within. And actually, you're most taken in by it whenever you're least critical of it. And that's kind of, it's interesting how, as well, in conversion, people who have not really maybe thought too much about these ideas can sometimes be very easily converted, right? So but the person who takes it really seriously, that young Christian who does everything, they pray, read their Bible, throw out their possessions, give to the poor, they do it all, and it begins to collapse not out of a lack of fidelity, but out of this deep fidelity. And so Jean Meslier, for me, represents something of that. And I think you might relate to him, some of you might relate to him, because he will reflect potentially some aspect of yourself when you've gone through that experience of questioning, of doubting, that's not really coming from without, but really coming from within, coming from a reflection critically of your own tradition, of your own experience. So Meslier, very interesting. You'll get a little audio clip about him. And then we get into just some of the other kind of like criticisms. And if I put them into a nutshell, you have one criticism from David Hume, who wrote this text where he has three people discussing. This is a very, it's not done very much now, but it was a tradition in philosophy where you would almost have plays where you'd have different characters would represent different positions, and then you would give life to your philosophy. And it's still done, but the existentialists, a lot of existentialists were playwrights, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Gabriel Marcel. These people, Albert Camus, were interested in putting philosophy into kind of incarnating it in characters. And that's my favorite kind of writing in a way. So what Hume did in this text, Natural Religion, is he has three people, Cleanthes, Demeus, and Dino. I can't forget the third, but there's three figures you're going to meet, and they all represent a kind of different theological approach. Now, Hume is interesting, like he doesn't have an atheist in this debate. They are all theists of a sort. One is a classical theist who believes that, in the arguments and for the existence of God. One of them is it's a kind of a mystic who doesn't believe that those arguments can get us anywhere. There's something beyond, but we cannot kind of grasp it through the mind. And then the other is someone who kind of believes in God, but kind of says, well, but if we look at the world and we take these arguments seriously, this God isn't all it's cracked up to be. And that's the interesting thing about the argument that you'll see, is he basically kind of has a go at the teleological argument. He doesn't say it's wrong, he doesn't say it's false. He says, no, let's take it as true, because he's writing pre-Darwin here, so like Hume doesn't have a good, I wonder if you're doing Darwin this week as well. Anyway, he doesn't have a good argument for, why things appear designed. But he kind of goes, well, no, let's just take the teleological argument for what it is. And he says, well, then you'd have to conclude that God is a bad designer, right? So you'd have to conclude that God isn't omnipotent, right? Because you look at the world and you look at the way animals are, et cetera, you can find all sorts of faults, right? So that's the kind of, and it's kind of disturbing. The reason why Hume didn't publish that until after his death is because, again, that would have been too controversial. I think it was published posthumously, but again, very, very controversial. More controversial than having an atheist critique it, because this is somebody going like, oh no, I think it's a fair enough argument, but hey, this is what you're left with. You're left with an incompetent God. So that's an interesting little argument, a little dig at the teleological argument. And then you have a couple of arguments that push even more, that say, well, the very concept of God is incoherent. And this is important because if the concept's incoherent, then you can't get off the ground. It's not that you have to critique every theological argument that comes along, every theistic argument that comes along. If you can show that from the beginning, the idea of God is a logical impossibility, then yes, to say then you don't have to kind of like wait for the next argument and the next argument, because from the very start you've said it doesn't work. And that's done in two ways, you'll see this week. One is a very famous, probably the most famous atheist argument, which is called the, I forget what it's called, the trilemma, maybe, but it's where you've got three statements, and not all three of them can be true. Right? And the three statements are, God is all good, God is all powerful, second statement, and there is evil, the third statement. So you've got those three statements, and the idea is you can have two, but you can never have three. And they say that about life, isn't it? You can have health, a good relationship, and good job, or whatever, but you can't have all three. There's always one that's not working. So this is similar, but at a deeper level, you can have two, but you can never have three. And the reason for that is you can have a God who is all powerful and all good, and there not be any evil in the world, right? Right, that makes sense, but that kind of cuts against our experience of the world, that we've experienced suffering and evil and get bad things all the time. So then you go, okay, well, you could have God as all powerful and there is evil, right? Because God could be all powerful but just not care, right? You know, who cares? So there's evil in the world, whatever. Or God could be all good and there is evil but not all powerful. So God would like to change things, but God can't, right? But you can see now what the argument is, and this is one of the arguments by a philosopher, Mackey. He kind of puts this out, that having all three of these is very difficult. Now, Mackey will say, this is very important, is that no theist just says that, right? God is all good, God is all powerful, there is evil. There's lots of nuances, right? So there's lots of ways in which you can kind of like make it more subtle. And you can say, well, you know, evil is to do with human freedom, right? Or the fall, or spiritual entities doing things, or whatever. So what happens is a back and forth where the theist starts to nuance their argument so as they can hold basically these three things together in some way. But Mackey is kind of pointing out that not that it all falls apart, but that the back and forth becomes so convoluted that the argument effectively becomes very unpersuasive. And another argument that's related to that, which you'll get by a guy called Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew wrote what is the probably most read philosophical essay in the history of the world. I don't know why it's so famous. It's called Theology and Falsification. And in that essay, he argues that when you talk to a theist, it's like, and he uses this parable, you'll get the parable, so I'm not going to tell you the parable because you're going to get it. But he basically says that what happens is when you're talking to a theist, if you're an atheist, is you make a claim and then they go away and find out a way of kind of changing the definition of God a little bit so as, you know, they get around it. And then you make another claim and this happens again and again. And every time, basically, every time you try to create a criteria for trying to prove or disprove God, the theist comes back with a reason why it doesn't work. And there's a version of this. This will maybe make sense because I've got in LA. I would see this as people who would believe, in say telepathy or something, and then you would show them, scientific studies in which, nothing was proven, but then they would come back and say, oh yes, but it doesn't work under certain conditions. And you go, okay, and so you rethink you find another thing that kind of gets around that, and then it comes back, oh yeah, no, it doesn't work under those conditions either. And you suddenly eventually go back and forth and you go, this is unfalsifiable. What you're saying, I'm not saying it's false, I'm just saying it's unfalsifiable. And so the argument that Anthony Flew uses is basically that a lot of the arguments for God are unscientific, meaning they're unfalsifiable. There's nothing you can do about them. You can listen to them, you can be persuaded by them, like you can like them, but you can't intellectually have any criteria to disprove it. And if you can't have a criteria to disprove something, it is it's what's called unfalsifiable, and then some philosophers would say it's actually meaningless. It's like a piece of music. You can listen to it and you can really enjoy the music, but it's meaningless in the sense of you can't know whether there's any truth in it. You might like the sound of it, but that's about it. So that's unfalsifiability, where it's a really interesting argument. And then one other one I'll mention is Immanuel Kant. Kant's in here. Kant considered himself a Christian, but I put him in here because he does give some of the best critiques of the classical arguments for God, and he gives a very good argument for the idea that we could never answer that question through reason. And basically what he says is, he says that the teleological argument, the argument from design, doesn't get you very, almost like what David Hume said, which is, it doesn't get you to God. What it gets you to is an intelligent designer. Maybe there's a hyper-intelligent group that programmed this and we're all in a simulation. It doesn't get you to God, it just gets you to an intelligent designer, and then to another designer, an intelligent designer above that, but doesn't get you to the standard notion of God. For that, the teleological argument has to rest on the cosmological argument, because the cosmological argument says you can't have an infinite regress, there has to be a God. And then Kant says, yes, but the cosmological argument doesn't get you God either. It gets you a universe maker, but that's not necessarily God. In order to argue that it's God, you need the ontological argument. So what Kant basically says is the teleological argument, even if it works, can only work because it rests on the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument can only work because it rests on the ontological argument. And then he says, and the ontological argument doesn't work because it treats existence as a property, something somebody has. You have red hair, you have a healthy body, and you have existence, right? Existence isn't like that. It's not a thing. It's how something manifests. So anyway, his argument is none of this works, but primarily what you'll see this week is his argument that pure reason, it's not that pure reason can't get you to some proof of God. The problem for Kant, and he shows this very powerfully in his book, The Critique of Pure Reason, is he says, could you say that again? Sorry, my Siri keeps talking to me. I don't know why. I'm going to take her off. Kant says, pure reason gets you to both positions. Through pure reason, you can argue that God exists, and through pure reason, you can argue that God doesn't. Through pure reason, you can argue that the universe is eternal, and you can argue that it is temporal, that it has a beginning, and you can argue that the universe is infinitely divisible. You can just cut it and cut it and cut it, or that there is some core indivisible dimension to it. And what Kant shows is reason, pure reason, can kind of get you to two completely opposite positions. He calls these aporias. And because pure reason can do that, then therefore for Kant, we can't rely on it to get us to the truth, because it obviously isn't a tool that allows for that. This is something that Hegel critiques after that, doesn't matter. That's Kant's argument. So Kant did have an argument for the existence of God, which was more an argument from hope in a way. But that's for another time. You can look it up if you'd like, talk to ChatGPT. But this week is all about the critiques. And I said you have Jean Meslier, who is this first systematic critique of God and of religion and of Christianity specifically. Like he goes for everything from the inside. Then we have this notion of the arguments not really giving us what we think they give us, and that's David Hume, and Kant says the same thing. And then we have the notion that maybe there's something in this very name God that is inconsistent in the definition. So in the same way that the ontological argument says God must exist by definition, these arguments say no, God must not exist. There's something about the definition of God that is so caught up in absurdities that it doesn't make sense. And so yeah, those are the arguments that you're going to encounter this week. This is, as I say, the last week of the common theism and atheism divide. The week after this, we will get more into then the mystics, and then the materialists, and then the existentialists, and each week will have a different flavor of atheism. This one, say, is most closely aligned with what's called the new atheism, and these are arguments that are, definitely worth knowing and exploring. But key to all of this is go at your own pace. Don't try and do everything unless you can. But whatever you do, approach it like a meditation. Approach it in a way to try to walk around inside it. I had a friend who's an artist, and he spent years painting in every major style of art until he got to his own style. So he would paint Baroque and Expressionist and Impressionist and Cubism, and he did it because he wanted to experience from the inside these different artistic movements. And so in a similar way, that's what I encourage you to do, is take each of these weeks and immerse yourself in it. Try to find the core animating spirit of each week. As I said last week, it was almost about saying we can know the truth. We can have access to some sort of truth. And that's fascinating. This week is kind of a stripping away of that, of a bit of intellectual humility and questioning. So enjoy that, get into it, get into the spirit of it, reflect on it. If you're able to do 3 or 4 of the reflections in the week, that's fantastic. And then we will take it from there. Okay, I'm going to see if there's any questions. Okay, from Tim. Altizer argues that Godhead necessarily contains both good and evil. What are your thoughts about our definitions of evil still being existent in the Godhead? Okay, well, yeah, so Tim, thank you. That's a really interesting question, which is also a pretty advanced question for where we are right now, because Altizer will actually be in Atheism for Lent in 3 weeks' time. And but yes, what Tim is asking or talking about is in this book, Godhead, Altizer argues, and basically it's a Freudian kind of argument, so correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, the argument is that evil is a type of enclosure, a type of contraction into yourself. So think of hedonism, the Freudian hedonism. The primary hedonism is where the subject becomes a subject by contracting. You're one with the mother, right? You're whatever, and then you contract into yourself. You construct an ego, and you become fascinated by that ego. It's called the mirror stage. This is where kids look in the mirror. They become fascinated in their own semblance, their own appearance. And this is, for Freud, necessary for love, because what love is the reaching out to the other, caring for the other and the other's desire. So it's really interesting. Within Freud, you have like an idea of a primary narcissism, like an original sin, right? A kind of a contraction into yourself, in order then to be able to reach out to the other. And then secondary narcissism is whenever you are traumatized and hurt, and therefore your libido is then brought into yourself. So you can't really care for the other because you're so immersed in your own suffering, right? So a lot of analysis is about helping you love, right? Helping you work through that pain so that you can actually libidinally invest in others again. All of that to say, Altizer has a kind of vision of God as the first act of creation is contraction. God has to contract in order for there to be space for anything to exist. So therefore, the theodicy of Altizer is this active contraction of libidinal disinvestment is in the very heart of God, which then allows for the creation of the universe and then love. So yes, all of that to say, Mackie wouldn't have very much, Mackie's kind of critique with the problem of evil is not sophisticated enough to kind of deal with that kind of vision. Sorry, I took ages there just to explain it, just to say, yes, Mackie is not dealing with that at all. I mean, Mackie's kind of using a very common sense notion of evil as just, people doing nasty things to each other, which is awful, but what you try and do in philosophy is get to the core of what evil is. And you could say that in all cultures, there are people who are so self-interested that they don't care about others and the desire of the other, and that manifests in all sorts of ways. And love is what allows one to bridge that gap, and that's a real problem for every society in history, anywhere in the world. That contraction of narcissism and that reaching out in love seems to be inherent to what it is to be human. And therefore you can't imagine a universe without evil, because you can't imagine a universe without that need to contract. Don't know if that made any sense, but yes, it's a good question, and maybe we can bring it up again when we're talking about Altizer in a few weeks. Let's see. Oh, Siri is trying to take over the conversation. I know, right? Oh, unbelievable. She did it a couple of times. It really puts me off. I think some people are having issues with the sound quality as well. Okay, well, some of you are saying I sound okay, some of you are saying I don't. So hopefully I'm going to listen back on it and see which of you is right and which of you is wrong. But in the meantime, enjoy the Atheism for Lent group as well. Use that as much as you want to put down your reflections and your thoughts, any other things that are coming up in your mind. I know some of you are using LLMs to have conversations as well, and that can be really useful too. But this week is the primary negation of classical theism, so it's classical atheism, and the week after is whenever we start getting into more theologically nuanced forms of atheism. So I hope you enjoy that. All right, wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.